Hmm. Hello, how are you? I'm better now. Hello, and welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance, and I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for you OGs who keep on coming back. And if you're new to my channel, very warm welcome to you. I hope everybody is doing very well. As you can see, we finally got our stuff. I'm in my new stuff room, and I'm probably going to call it the stuff room because it is not just books, it's my knitting stuff, it's my sewing stuff, all kinds of stuff. Yes, very happy that we got our stuff. Not everything is organized and in its rightful place yet, but I'm working on it. It is a process, but I was able to get my books up. As you can see, I'm super happy about that. I have a shirt that you probably haven't seen for 6 months. So let me tell you, unpacking after stuff has been in storage for 6 months, it's like Christmas. I forgot about so much stuff. And then I also I'm on my 4th box of stuff going to Goodwill. Let me tell you something. I can't recommend enough doing this experiment. If you want to find out what stuff you really don't need, downsize. We went from an 1,800 square foot house to a 300 square foot living space in a camper for 6 months. We put the bulk of our stuff in storage and just took what we thought we would need. And yeah, you get that stuff back and you realize all the stuff that you don't need. It's super cathartic just getting rid of stuff. The minimalist lifestyle is so attractive to me and it's just so comforting to me, and I am embracing it more and more every day. But what are we doing today? Today we're doing my March wrap up. March was a pretty good month for me. It was a little bit of a struggle. I kind of bit off, well, I wouldn't say I bit off more than I can chew, but I found myself struggling to read more just because of doing the Booktube prize. I was reading books that I couldn't talk about in my wrap-ups. I couldn't talk about the books that I read for the Booktube prize until April. I put myself in kind of a stressful situation that I don't want to do anymore, but you know, we'll see. I love following certain prizes. It is what it is. Let's start off with stats. Just to go over the books that I read in the first half of the month. I read Liberation Day by George Saunders and Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng. Both of those were for the Booktube prize. Then I read This Time Tomorrow by Emma Straub, A Kind of Spark by Elle McNichol, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, The Three of Us by Ori Agbaje Williams, Spy X Family by Tetsuya Endo, Heartstopper Volume 4, and Vanishing Acts by Jodi Picoult. Not bad for the first half of the month. If you want to find out more about what I said about those books, I will link my mid-month wrap-up down below in the box. If you want to hear more about the books that I was tasked with reading for the Booktube prize, I will link that video also down in the box. I read a total of 15 books in March, which I think is the most I read in a month so far this year. No DNFs yet, I think, for the year. Spoiler alert, there is a DNF coming in April. Out of the 15 books, 13 of them were written by women, which I think is apropos because March was International Women's Month, isn't it? Pretty cool. 5 of the authors were people of color. I read 9 physical books, 2 digital books on my e-reader, and 4 audiobooks, which is low for me. As far as ratings, not bad. 6 of the 15 books were rated 4 stars or above. That's pretty good. I had 1 5-star book. I'm super excited to talk about it. So the books that I read in the second half of March, the first one is Pod by Layleen Paul. This is the first book that I read from the Women's Prize for Fiction. The long list was announced March 7th, I believe. And so I'm making my way through as many books as I can. I saw it sitting in the library. I couldn't believe my luck, and I snatched it right off the shelf. This book, I loved this book. I think it's going to be one of those books that is somewhat polarizing, but it's so beautifully written. This book talks about issues and themes that we deal with as people, but instead of exploring those themes through human characters, you're exploring them through characters of different species in the ocean. You're mainly following Ia. She's a young spinner dolphin. She's the main character, but I would say there's about 5 main characters that you kind of follow along, that they're all connected. In this world, spinner dolphins and bottlenose dolphins don't get along. Ia finds herself ostracized from her pod of spinner dolphins, and she is taken quite against her will and becomes a part of the bottlenose pod. And you follow her struggle, learning how to survive, not only in this pod, but in an ocean that is dealing with pollution, mass extinctions, basically all the nasty things that humans are doing to the ocean. You're also following a whale who is traveling the ocean by himself because his family's been killed, and he is trying to get the word out to other beings in the ocean that there's danger out there and that you have to do something or else it's going to get worse. You're following a wrasse who is a deep water fish whose entire school has disappeared right before his eyes, and he's learning how to survive in an entirely new environment by himself. All of these characters I found super relatable, considering that they're a different species, but they're all talking about issues that concern us all globally. There's a couple of scenes that I want to just tell you about that I just found super moving and super beautifully handled. There's a scene where the whale, who has lost his family, and he comes across another small pod of whales who are just enjoying their lives. They're swimming, they're dancing in the water, they're having a great time, just enjoying life. And the whale joins them for a while, and they're all having a great time, but the whale tries to explain to them that the ocean is a dangerous, dangerous place, and they need to be mindful because they're in danger themselves, and they're having such a great time. They just don't want to listen to the whale, and they just go about their business. And I thought it was a great demonstration about how people who are happy in their own lives, where there's no danger to them, they're reluctant to be receptive to the hardship of others when that hardship doesn't touch them personally. And I just thought that was a beautiful way to kind of put that out there without it being in your face. There's another scene that deals with the wrasse, and evidently in the marine world, the wrasse is able to switch sexes, go from male to female and back again. And there's a scene where the wrasse is flipping sex. Another marine animal who's been hanging out with the wrasse notices a third marine animal who is kind of looking at the wrasse going, what is happening? What are you doing? Kind of being judgy. And the first fish says, don't stare at my friend like that. A lot of people are sexually confused these days. It's happening everywhere. And I just thought that was lovely just to add that in there. And then speaking of that, the word people is used a lot when character in here is referring to her own group or another group. I guess by definition, people is a collective group of persons or human beings. But I liked the way people was used in the story, that it was just a collective group of beings. I feel like it was Laylene Paul's way of demonstrating that human beings aren't the only beings that are sentient. And so she referred to all species of being a people, a collective group with interests and purpose. And I really love that about this story. Now, I will say it's very dense in places. There are large chunks of this book that are without dialogue, so very dense, but it's usually describing a certain species or describing an area. The way she does it is just so beautifully written that you find yourself just getting through that denseness of no dialogue. That's not to say there is no dialogue. There is dialogue, just it's not a whole lot. And ultimately, this book is about different species learning to coexist together. And that is a lesson I think we all can learn from. But you're also dealing with masculine toxicity, you're dealing with sexual politics. I've heard some other people talk about how they were put off by there's multiple rape scenes in here, but it's not like it's graphically described. There aren't graphic sex scenes in here. It was sexual politics within the species that I think actually happens not only with dolphins, but with other species. But I think the word rape was used here just to be kind of a relatable term to the reader. So I don't think it would be a trigger for anybody. I mean, we're talking about dolphins here, but I just wanted to put that out there. If you find what's happening to species on our planet, what's happening to our Earth, incredibly worrisome, you will find this book incredibly sad, because it does talk a lot about what's happening to our oceans. And it really, really hurt my heart in a lot of places in this book. So there is that. There is a scene in the second to last chapter that is extremely violent and incredibly sad. It surrounds an event that actually takes place in real life. I was just sobbing my eyes out at the end. But ultimately, I loved this story. I love Lailene Paul's writing. I will be reading her other book. She does a similar treatment in a book called The Bees. I love this book. I didn't give it 5 stars just because of the denseness of the book, but ultimately I love the story. I loved the characters. There were some funny parts as well, and I would definitely recommend this book. I gave Pod 4 stars. The next book I read was The Dog of the North by Elizabeth Mackenzie. This book was also longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. I listened to this book, and this is one of the books that I was most excited for off the long list. It just sounded so fun and engaging. I think the synopsis was a little bit of false advertising. I'll just read it right here real quick. The Goodreads synopsis says, follows Penny on her quest for a fresh start. There will be a road trip in an old van with gingham curtains, a piñata, and stiff brakes. There will be injury and peril. There will be a dog named Queecoats and 2 brothers who may share a toupee. There will be questions. Why is it a detective investigating her grandmother? And what is the scintillator? And can Penny recognize a good thing when it finally comes her way? It sounds like it's going to be an adventure with all these mishaps and quirky events. And it did kind of have all those things. Like, for instance, well, it mentions the dog named Queecoats. The dog is very, very minimally mentioned. The 2 brothers who share a toupee. No, the one brother says he does, but the other brother says, no, that doesn't happen. So that's not even a quirky part of the story. So let me just back up. You're following Penny. Her life is basically falling apart. Her marriage is over. She's quit her job. She wants a fresh start. And she goes to visit her grandmother, who is a eccentric woman, a retired doctor. Her last name is Pincer, but for whatever reason that's not explained, Penny calls her Pincer, which, who does that? I think she takes a train to go visit her grandmother, and her grandmother's accountant, Bert, picks her up in this van that's mentioned in the synopsis. And it is an old van, and he's got just all kinds of weird stuff in the back, and he comes across as quite quirky but kind. Penny finds herself endeared to him. Through Bert, Penny meets Dale, who is Bert's younger brother, and Penny finds herself attracted to Dale, but for reasons, Dale is off limits to Penny. You also learn that Penny's mom and stepdad went missing in the Australian outback 5 years before. Penny's father is estranged, he's eccentric, and they have a strained relationship. Penny's sister Margaret is a successful woman with a family who also lives in Australia. They're somewhat estranged as well. So you follow Penny. Penny gets to her grandmother's house, and you realize that Pincer is at the very beginning of dementia. As Penny's trying to help her grandmother clean up her house to sell her house, she makes kind of a grim discovery in the basement where Pincer has been doing some experiments, and the story goes from there. Now, this book had such potential. You had all these quirky characters, you had all these quirky goings on, but unfortunately, there are a lot of things that don't get wrapped up in the story. You never really find out what happened to her parents. You never find out the basis of Pincer's legal troubles. Not really. I really enjoyed the characters. The characters had that quirkiness that reminded me of Carl Hyacin, which I love. They were super fun to follow for a while. The dialogue was funny. I liked Penny a lot. I loved Bert. But I felt this story needed more depth. I felt there was too much going on, and if they had cut, I guess, the shenanigans in half, there would have been more time to resolve all of them, but none of them were resolved. It's almost like this is a story that a friend is telling you over coffee, and you're sitting there and you're drinking your coffee and maybe having your cupcake and going, and you're listening to the story and it's engaging at the time, but by the time the story is over, you don't really care about it and it's left your mind. It's that kind of story. So while I was engaged, while I was reading it, I felt ultimately it was a disappointment. I'm not sure if I'm going to record a video of my predictions for the Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist. So for now, I'll just say I don't think this one will move on to the shortlist. I gave The Dog of the North 2.5 stars. The next book I read is another Women's Prize for Fiction book, and that is The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. This was my first Maggie O'Farrell, and I have to say, I'm a fan. I did not expect to like this so much. As a matter of fact, I wasn't planning on reading this one. While I am a fan of historical fiction, I usually don't gravitate towards the time period of the 1500s. I just didn't think this one was going to be for me. However, it was available at the library, so of course I snatched it right off the shelf with a quickness. And oh my God, I'm so glad I did. Will I read Hamnet? Still not sure. Just because the whole Shakespeare thing, I don't know. But will I read more by Maggie O'Farrell? Definitely. So this one follows Lucrezia. She is the middle child of 8 children of an Italian family, the father of whom is a duke. She is actually based on an actual character. And the way it worked back then is female children of royal families were married off that benefited their families in some way. And they usually did it at a young age. Lucrezia has a couple of older sisters, one of whom is Maria, and Maria has been arranged to marry Alfonso, the Duke of Ferrara, I believe. I might get some names incorrect here. But not long before the wedding, Maria dies, and so the next one in line is Lucrezia, and Lucrezia stands in to marry Alfonso. Lucrezia is 13 years old, and Lucrezia remembers meeting Alfonso, I believe during the engagement party for Alfonso and Maria, and she remembers Alfonso gesturing towards her in a very endearing way, a very sweet way. So Lucrezia, while she's still very nervous about being married off to this man, she has hope because her first impression of him is of a kind, gentle man. And you follow her story from there, and you get to know Alfonso at the same time Lucrezia is getting to know Alfonso. And it's becoming more clear and more clear that the only reason Lucrezia is there is to produce an heir for Alfonso. And while he comes across as very charming and very kind and very gentle, he has this way that Maggie O'Farrell writes him that you question yourself, that there's something not quite right. And it's absolutely chilling. This book was brilliantly written. It is a historical fiction, takes place in the 1500s in Italy, but it reads like a thriller. It's somewhat of a slow burn, but Lucrezia is so endearing as a character. You immediately care about her. You immediately worry for her. And because you feel so protective of Lucrezia, even during the somewhat slow parts, you just are turning the pages wanting to find out what happens to her. And here's the other brilliant thing that Maggie O'Farrell does, is at the very beginning of the story and in actual real life history, you know that Lucrezia marries Alfonso and within a year she dies. So you're basically following that year with Lucrezia, finding out what happens to her. And even though you know at the beginning what's going to happen to her, you are turning the pages with hope, saying, well, maybe she gets out of it. Maybe things end differently for Lucrezia. And another thing I love about this story is that Italy is also a character in this book. Italy is described so perfectly and so beautifully. Between the landscapes and the colors and the architecture and the art and the food, I really, really enjoyed that in this story. And finally, that ending, you guys, that ending was just masterful and perfect, totally unexpected. Wow, it just really packed a punch. I loved it. Super accessibly written. You'd think that a book that took place in the 1500s, that certain language and vernacular is going to be used that's not as accessible as contemporary, but the way it's written, it's very accessible, minus the slang. Language is spoken just the way we speak in today's language, and I really, really appreciate it. It made it very easy to read. I would definitely recommend this if you like a good historical fiction. I gave The Marriage Portrait 4 stars. The next book I read was Foster by Claire Keegan. This was my first Claire Keegan. This is a standalone short story, and you're following a young girl, I believe it's in the 70s. It takes place in rural Ireland. She lives in a home with parents who are poor, and they have several children, many children, I believe, and her mom is pregnant with, I want to say, the 8th child. The main character, Petal is her name, or at least that's what they call her. She is sent to live with a childless couple out on a farm for an unknown amount of time so that the mother can concentrate on the rest of their children and having her next child. Petal, as she gets to know these foster parents, she is treated with an affection and kindness that she did not receive in her home. And she starts to bloom. Story basically follows her time with her foster parents, and you learn why this couple doesn't have children. And I found the story really interesting. I wasn't sure how in-depth it was going to be when it's only 92 pages. I thought to myself, how much can happen in 92 pages? So much, you guys. It's so beautiful and heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. It's one of those stories. I'm usually not a fan of short stories, but I understand why this one, the way it ended, is a short story. I'm not going to tell you how it ends. I could see if this had ended in a different way, how this could be a full-length novel. And there's just very little I can tell you about it because I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's beautiful. The ending is quite sad and heartwarming at the same time, which I think demonstrates a brilliance of the author to make you feel those two emotions at the same time. So yes, I'm glad I read it. I would read more Claire Keegan. While a whole lot doesn't quite happen in the story, there is a depth that goes straight to the heart. I would recommend this. I gave Foster 3.5 stars. I also read The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty, but that review is in the other video for the Booktube prize. That's linked down below. Finally, the last book I want to talk about that I read in the month of March is The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. Guys, I'm just going to put this right out there right at the beginning. I love this book. I loved it. I listened to it, and I highly recommend listening to it. It was very well narrated. This, of course, is on the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction. If this doesn't make it on the short list, I will be heartbroken. Heartbroken. And I have to say, I have to kind of toot my own horn here. I put this on my books that I have been excited to be published, I believe for January. This was one of those books that I had heard about and made a video of 5 books that I'm excited for. So I was super excited to read this, and then when I saw that it was long listed for the Women's Prize, perfect. This story takes place in India, and you're following Geeta. Her husband has been missing for 5 years, and people of the village believe that Geeta killed her husband, and there's all sorts of different stories that are milling around the rumor mill of how Geeta killed her husband, and they kind of believe her to be a witch, which kind of works in her favor. So people kind of fear her. And Geeta is also part of this group of women that's called a loan group. And I'm not sure exactly how that works, but it's almost like a book club, but they loan each other money. And one day, one of the members of this loan club, Farah, comes to Geeta asking for help. She always comes to their club with bruises on her face, and everybody knows, but nobody talks about it. Farah asks Geeta's help to get rid of her husband. And Geeta's like, no, that's not what I do. But she doesn't come right out and say that she didn't kill her husband, but because she knows that the rumors that she did work in her favor. And Farah, you can tell, is trying to wheedle out, well, isn't that what you did to your husband? And we can do this to my husband because isn't that what you did to your husband? It finally comes to a head where Farah convinces Geeta to help her get rid of her husband. And the story goes from there. This book is about women friendships. It's about the caste system in India. It is about sexual politics. It deals with issues of domestic violence, of childlessness, of abuse of all kinds, and it deals with women's rights. I love the way this story was put together. There's a lot of humor in this book, albeit a lot of it is dark humor, but the depth in which it deals with those issues that I just said, just beautifully handled. What I found really interesting is the title of the book, The Bandit Queens, refers to an actual woman. I believe her name was Phulan Devi, who was referred to as the Bandit Queen in India. She took revenge on her abusers, and she became an activist for women's rights. And her story is quite impressive. But how it applies to this story, I thought it was just brilliantly explored. I think my favorite storyline was Geeta's friendship with Saloni, another member of the Loan Club. Saloni and Geeta were best friends when they were growing up, but they had a falling out, and it had to do with Geeta's husband. And then as things start to go haywire, as Geeta is helping Farah Gita and Saloni start to deal with what happened to their friendship, and they start to get to know each other again. And it talks about women's betrayal and what they do to each other, but then it also talks about their loyalty and their devotion to each other. And I just love that. I love this book. When I finished this book, I was thinking maybe it was 4 stars. I don't know. It was not one of those books where I'm like, oh, I'm loving it. I'm loving it as I'm reading it. I was enjoying it. But at the end, when I finished the book, I loved the way it ended. I loved the way everything was wrapped up. I loved the writing of the book. I loved the characters. By the time I finished this book, I was trying to think of a reason why I couldn't give it 5 stars. And I couldn't think of anything. So I gave the Bandit Queens 5 stars. All the stars. I loved it. Again, if this doesn't make the short list, I will be shocked, I will be heartbroken, and I'll be quite angry, I think. Highly, highly recommend the Bandit Queens. This was my one and only 5-star read for March, and it was my favorite of the month. So that is it. Those are the books that I read in the month of March. How was your reading month? I would love to know, what was your favorite book of the month in March? Have you read any of these books? I would love to hear your thoughts, or you can just say hi down in the doodly-doo. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.